In this video, I am going to show you how to close off and finish the end of a sock that has been cranked on a circular sock knitting machine and get it to this point. Hey there, welcome to the SweetGeorgia channel. I am Felicia from SweetGeorgia, and today I want to talk about how to finish the toes on a sock that has been cranked on a circular sock knitting machine. Now, if you followed our channel over the years, you'll see that I have cranked a number of socks. I have a whole bunch of socks in this very container as well. I crank a lot of socks on my Erlbacher Speedster circular sock knitting machine, but I've never actually shown you how to close the toes on these socks. So you can see I have a sock here that I can finish. I have a couple of socks here that are ready to finish. And so I'm going to show you how I go about doing that. So very quickly, I started off as a hand knitter. So when I learned how to graft toes, I learned how to graft from 2 knitting needles. So with stitches holding 2 knitting needles and then grafting between the stitches on either knitting needle. And so when I first started grafting the toes on a sock that was knit from a circular sock knitting machine, I would pick up half of the stitches onto a fine double pointed needle and then the other half of the stitches onto a second double pointed needle. And then I would proceed to graft, as I always have, from these 2 needles. And it was only maybe in the last year that I learned that we don't have to do that. We can actually graft directly from the waste yarn of your cranked sock. There is definitely more than one way to graft and finish the toes of a sock, but this is just one of the ways that I learned recently, and I want to share that with you. So first things first, here is a sock that is halfway through being grafted. You can see this waste yarn is all being tucked up inside, and I'm continuing to progress along and graft the end of that toe. But that is basically how it works. So this is the top of your sock, and what I'm going to do is sort of fold in all of this waste yarn like so, and we are going to graft across the top of the toe. And once it's done, it should look nice and smooth, like you can't even tell that this was grafted. Now, first things first, let's look at the needle. I'm using this needle for grafting the socks. Okay, this is how large the needle is. Now, in the past, for seaming knitted garments and things like that, I would use a needle that's like this. This is from Clover. This is a chibi needle, so it's got a little bit of a bent tip, but you can see compared to the needle that I'm using for grafting the toes on the sock, and so it's much more difficult to get this through all of my tiny little sock stitches. So I prefer to use the smaller silver needle here. It is shorter, it's easier to hold, it's easier to manage, and it's thinner. Doesn't have the bent tip, but that hasn't seemed to be a problem. So in any case, that's what I'm using. So I keep all of my spare needles and a couple of stitch markers, and I actually save the waste yarn that I pull off of the sock, and I reuse it in other socks that I crank. First, let's get oriented. This is my short row toe right here, and here's the opening that I want to graft. And you can see the goal here is I'm going to take my yarn end, this is the end of my yarn, I want to take it to the outside and then graft this side to this side, this side to this side, this side to this side, and on and on and on until I get to the end. And so I need to close up this space, and you can hopefully see here where the top half and the bottom half of this opening, there's a little bit of a hole right here. And so I want to close up that hole before I go any further. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to thread my needle. And then looking at this opening, you can see this is my one stitch on this side, and this is the other stitch on the other side of the opening, and this is a kind of a gap between the top and the bottom of that opening. So what I want to do is I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go through this stitch here, take up that bar so that I can close up this gap, and then I'm going to take my needle and then go into this stitch on the top side of the fabric. And when it pokes through the other side, I am going to be able to see what I'm doing. I'm going to tuck in that waste yarn inside here, tuck all of this inside. So now that I've flipped my waste yarn to the inside, now I can see very clearly where I'm going to be grafting. You can see I want to follow the path of the waste yarn actually. And I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go through this first stitch on the bottom side. And you can see that as I go into this stitch, I'm going to take the tip of my needle and I'm going to follow where the yellow waste yarn goes. and the second stitch at the same time. So I'm entering the first stitch from the front to the back, and then I'm going through the second stitch on the bottom half from back to front. And this is purely because I'm following the path of that yellow waste yarn. And then I go back to the front side and I look at where that waste yarn is, and it's making a line behind those two legs of a knit stitch. So I'm going to take my needle in here, go behind those two legs, and again, following the path of the yellow waste yarn. I'm going to go like that. And I'm going to snug it up as I go. In the past, I would have left it big and loose and floppy and then go back over and tighten up all the stitches later. But I found that it's actually not too difficult to put in the right amount or a good amount of tension and close up your gap. So now again, I have my yarn coming out at the top half of the opening, and I'm going to go back to the bottom and pick up behind two legs. So I have this leg of one knit stitch and another leg of the next stitch. Okay, again, I'm following the path of the yellow waste yarn. Again, going from the bottom side, finish the bottom, I'm going to go back to the top now. On the top side, picking up those two legs and following the path of the yellow waste yarn. So I tighten up the stitches just enough so I can maintain the size of the stitch, and hopefully all the stitches will stay the same size. Sometimes I'll put my finger behind the stitches and then you can see them a little bit easier. You can see I'm picking up these two legs of the knit stitch, and it is where the yellow waste yarn would be headed, just following the path of that yellow waste yarn. And then going to the bottom side. And again, if you stretch it out a little bit, you can see where that yellow yarn is going. It's linking this knit stitch to this knit stitch. And so I'm going into this leg and then out that leg. And as I continue across, I'm going to keep trying to stuff my waste yarn inside. I just have to maneuver the fabric a little bit so that I can see this very clearly and pick up from this line. This is where it's really helpful if your waste yarn is in a contrasting color from your sock yarn. We're getting very close to the end, just the last couple of stitches to graft together. This is where it's actually very, very crucial that you make sure that you've captured all of the live ends of these stitches. When you go and you remove the waste yarn, you don't want your sock to unravel if you have accidentally missed one of these legs, missed catching all of these live stitches. And so sometimes what I'll do is at the very end, I'll do a couple of extra, a couple of extra legs just to make sure that I caught every single one. Like if I didn't catch maybe this last leg and then I were to rip out the waste yarn, I might actually lose this stitch and the whole thing would just run down my sock and I would have to undo it and re-crank the sock, which has been known to happen. So just want to double check to make sure I've caught all of the live stitches. Now that I've captured all of the live ends of the stitches, I'm going to take my yarn, my sock yarn, and I'm going to take it into the inside of my sock. Okay, so I'm just feeding the needle inside, and then what I want to do is turn the sock inside out. Okay, so now what I do is I've turned the sock inside out, I put my hand inside the sock, and I kind of hold it open so that I can take my needle and I'm going to weave in this last tail end of the yarn. So basically all I do is I go along this side and I pick up a stitch, a purl bump, probably every other row, picking up a purl bump here, here, and maybe one more, maybe here, okay? And then I pull my yarn through. This is just weaving in the end of my yarn. And then I'm going to go back the other direction as well. So again, picking up a purl bump about every other row or so. And that is just to finish off my yarn. My yarn tail will go like this. And then what I'll do is I'll trim it to about that long and then flip it back inside out, and then I will wash the sock. So here, now what I can do is I can just take out all of my waste yarn because I don't need any of this anymore. When I take off the waste yarn, I actually roll it back up into a butterfly. Okay, and if it's not in too bad condition, I'll actually save this waste yarn and I'll reuse it again to crank another pair of socks. That's that end. And with the cuff, I also weave in the end. And this is just very simple. I'll just sort of weave into the cuff of the sock inside, so you can't really see what's going on. Going back and forth a little bit. Yeah, just going back and forth a little bit in the cuff of the sock, like so. And then I will actually bury the needle inside. I'm basically ticking the needle tip and sticking it inside the cuff, and I'm going to pull out the yarn over here, and I would trim that close to the edge, and then eventually the yarn will just get sucked up into the end of the cuff. So this is the hung hem, and the yarn will just go inside there. Okay, so we flip the sock back inside out, my nicely grafted toe. You can barely see where that line is. When you go and wash it, it should even out a little bit more, but that looks actually great. No drop stitches, no nothing, and that is basically how we finish a toe. So you can see with this particular sock, this one has a ton of waste yarn, and so this would be very awkward to try to fold inside and try to graft from. So with this one, I would definitely remove most of, maybe three quarters of this waste yarn. I would just first remove it so that it's a little bit less waste yarn to have to manage during that whole grafting process. Now that seems a lot more manageable, and I can actually go ahead and graft this sock as well. And to make this whole process a little bit more efficient and a little bit more fun for me, what I do is I'll crank a whole bunch of socks in a row and then put them into this container. And I'm just bringing this container with me. This is a bag, it's like a little train case. And so I have all of my socks that need to be grafted down here, and all of the socks that are finished will go up here. And so I've been making myself a little bit of a collection of socks here. So ungrafted, completely finished, and then that way I can also keep my needles in here, all of my little tools, scissors, all of that kind of stuff. And this has been really portable. I can take this wherever I go, and this is my sock finishing kit. So that is basically it for today. If you would like to join in with us and have a conversation about how to knit socks with a circular sock knitting machine and how to use hand-dyed yarns for sock knitting, I would love to hear from you. We are having these conversations in our Discord channel for SweetGeorgia, and you can find the link in the description box below. You can also join our email list to find out when new videos are released and when we have new colorways and new content for SweetGeorgia. These are all colorways from our monthly sock club that we have called the Secret Stash Club. So we would love to see you in that as well. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one. All right, bye for now.